Today's lesson is Rainforests of the Sea Under Threat. Hi, everybody. My name is Roger.
And my name is Helen.
And today we are going to talk about rainforests in Brazil. No, we're not going to talk about Brazilian rainforests. We're actually going to be talking about rainforests that are underwater. We're describing these coral reefs as being rainforests of the sea, but they are under threat.
Right. When we think of rainforests, we normally think of perhaps the Amazon rainforest, which is one of the biggest in the world, and it contains a lot of different forms of life, a lot of different plants and animals, and together they make up this incredible natural environment. So that's the rainforest that's above the water, above the sea. But there is also a quote-unquote rainforest that exists under the sea. We can say that because it's made up of a lot of different life forms, a lot of, in this case, we're talking about corals and fish and algae and all sorts of underwater life.
Exactly. Now, of course, it's absurd to refer to this as a rainforest underwater because, of course, it doesn't rain underwater. There's already lots of rain there, so you can't possibly have rain there. But I suppose you could get away with calling this a forest because coral is a living thing like trees are, and you've got lots of living things there. So we're going to continue talking about this in terms of it being a rainforest under the sea, but also it's known as a coral reef, and there are coral reefs in various parts of the world. So let's get to it, everybody. Let's chat no longer and listen first to the first part, and then we'll come back to discuss it.
Rainforests of the sea under threat. Known as the rainforests of the sea, coral reefs provide a home for all sorts of sea creatures. In fact, they support more than a quarter of all marine species, despite making up less than 1% of the ocean floor. Commonly found in shallow tropical waters, they can extend for many kilometers, often following the shape of a country's coast.
大家好，第一部分我们看到名词 rainforest 指雨林，例如 rainforests being cut down in order to start farms is harmful to the planet. 为了耕作而砍伐雨林对地球有害。
So let's take a look at these rainforests of the sea. Now, known as the rainforests of the sea, coral reefs provide a home for all sorts of sea creatures. So coral reefs are beautiful structures, beautiful living things under the sea. Specifically, coral is a very small sea creature that lives in large groups, and usually they look like plants. So upon first encountering them, you might think that they're plants or maybe they're stone because they're hard and they don't really move that much. And you wouldn't consider them as sea creatures, as a kind of animal, but they are. So corals are very small sea creatures. And these corals, the place where they live, altogether, they are called reefs. And a lot of fish and other sea creatures live around these coral reefs. So coral reefs provide homes for all sorts of sea creatures.
And remember, the word coral can be both count and non-count. So if you're talking about different species of coral, then you can say corals. But if you talk about coral in general, then it's a non-count noun. There is very much coral near Australia, for example. So yes, indeed, they provide a home for all sorts of sea creatures, fish, anemones, or whatever. And in fact, they support more than a quarter of all marine species, despite making up less than 1% of the ocean floor. So more than 25% of all ocean living things in the ocean, more than a quarter of them will live on a coral reef, despite the fact that coral reefs only take up 1% of the ocean floor. So that is pretty spectacular. You can expect to see lots of life forms on a coral reef.
Yes, and commonly found in shallow tropical waters, they can extend for many kilometers, often following the shape of a country's coast. So Coral reefs don't exist in the middle of the ocean. They are usually found in shallow waters, in tropical waters, which is why sometimes when you look at them from above, when they can be seen from above, you will see them following the outline or the shape of a coast, of a country's coast.
Exactly. So that, of course, is a spectacular feature of coral reefs. They grow close to continents or countries, and they usually exist in shallow tropical waters, so you won't see them by Alaska or Siberia. And of course, they can be quite long, and we'll talk about some long coral reefs as our lesson continues. So let's move on now to the second part and learn some more about coral reefs.
One of the most extraordinary examples is the Belize Barrier Reef off the eastern coast of Central America. Stretching for 290 kilometers, it boasts 106 species of corals, 500 fish species, and more than 300 types of mollusks. One area of the reef, the Great Blue Hole, is 124 meters deep and full of all kinds of colorful tropical fish, as well as several species of sharks, making it one of the best diving spots in the world.
第二部分我们看到动词 boast， 意思是拥有值得自豪的事物。例如 The resort boasts a golf course and a spa. 那个度假村拥有高尔夫球场和水疗中心。或是 Taipei once boasted the world's tallest building. 台北曾经拥有全球最高的建筑。另外这个字也有炫耀或是吹嘘的意思。我们可以说 Tim boasted to all of his friends that he lived in the biggest house in town. Tim 向他朋友炫耀说他住在镇上最大的房子。
So we're going to look more specifically at coral reefs, and one of the most extraordinary examples is the Belize Barrier Reef off the eastern coast of Central America. So there are several coral reefs in the world, and one of the most extraordinary is this one, the Belize Barrier Reef. And something that is extraordinary is very unusual, very surprising, but usually in a good way. So you can say that the world has many extraordinary creatures, many extraordinary animals, because they are so unusual, so beautiful. Together they make this world very interesting.
Right, and of course extra means more than, and ordinary just means common. So of course they're more than common, they're very, very special. And extraordinary is how this word is most often pronounced, but you probably will hear some people say extraordinary, although I will say extraordinary is far more common. And of course this is a good example of a coral reef. It's the Belize Barrier Reef off the coast of Central America. Of course, Belize is a country in Central America next to Guatemala and Mexico there. And stretching for 290 kilometers, it boasts 106 species of corals, 500 fish species, and more than 300 types of mollusks. So if you're a marine biologist, or if you like scuba diving or even snorkeling, this could be a place for you. If you don't have the time and money to go down to Australia to see the Great Barrier Reef, this is a fine substitute in Central America. It's quite long, 290 kilometers long. And here we've got the word boast. To boast oftentimes means you're bragging about yourself. Boy, I've been to 165 countries. I have 6 billion NT dollars in the bank. I own 7 houses on Yangmingshan, etc., etc. There you're boasting. But in this particular case, it just means it has these things, and they are special things.
Right. It's often used by travel agencies or magazine articles that talk about a particular place. You can say that this place boasts many museums or a lot of monuments, so it's usually used in a tourism travel context. So this particular barrier reef, the Belize Barrier Reef, has all of these species of coral and fish, and it also has 300 types of mollusks. Now, a mollusk is an animal that has a soft body with no bones, and it's usually covered by a hard shell. So when you know this description of a mollusk, then you might immediately think of a snail. A snail is considered to be a mollusk, and also an octopus is a mollusk.
Or a slug as well. They're all mollusks. And one area of the reef, the Great Blue Hole, is 124 meters deep and full of all kinds of colorful tropical fish, as well as several species of sharks, making it one of the best diving spots in the world. So the Great Blue Hole, of course, appears in lots of travel posters, and you see this online all the time, the Great Blue Hole. It's quite deep there, 124 meters deep, and it's got all sorts of colorful tropical fish and lots of sharks there, so I suppose you need to be careful. But it, as a result, becomes one of the best diving spots in the world. Here, diving is referring to scuba diving. I'm sure there are lots of places in that area that teach scuba diving or offer scuba diving classes.
That's right. So this place does sound really amazing, and I can understand now why people would call these places rainforests of the sea, because they do contain a lot of different plants and sea creatures that together live in this particular environment.
Exactly. So yes, start making plans to go there as soon as you can. Okay, that brings us to the end of the second part of our lesson for today. It's time now to move on to the third part. We'll listen first.
But even this amazing example pales in comparison to the most extensive coral reef ecosystem in the world, Australia's Great Barrier Reef. The vast organic structure, which stretches for over 2,300 kilometers down the east coast of Australia, supports an astonishing diversity of species, including 30 species of whales and dolphins, 1,500 types of fish, and 14 species of sea snakes, many of which are rare or endangered. It's so huge that it can be seen from space.
第三部分我们看到单字 extensive， 这个字是形容词，指广阔的或是覆盖范围广的。举例来说 Randy has an extensive collection of classical records. Randy 有大量的古典乐唱片收藏。也可以说 The detective carried out an extensive investigation in an attempt to solve the crime. 警探进行大规模的调查，试图解开这宗犯罪案。另外补充这个字的名词 extent, E-X-T-E-N-T, extent, 表示范围或是程度，像是 Andrew is stressed to the extent that he hasn't been able to sleep recently. Andrew 的压力已经大到他最近都没办法入眠的程度。再补充这个字的动词 extend, E-X-T-E-N-D, extend, 指延长或是扩展。举例来说Casper was having a wonderful time in Thailand, so he decided to extend his stay. Casper 在泰国玩得很开心，所以他决定延长停留的时间。或是 The clothing company wants to extend its range of products to include jewelry. 那间服饰公司想要拓展产品范围，加入珠宝首饰。最后我们看到形容词 astonishing， 指令人惊讶的或是惊人的。举例来说We saw some astonishing temples on our trip to Central America. 我们在中美洲之旅中看到了一些令人惊叹的庙宇。或是 The mountain climber showed an astonishing lack of fear as he scaled the sheer cliff. 那名登山者攀爬峭壁时展现了惊人的无畏精神。另外补充这个字的同义形容词 astounding. A-S-T-O-U-N-D-I-N-G, astounding.表示令人惊奇的。我们可以说 Ellie made an astounding discovery when she went on an archaeological dig in Morocco. Ellie 去摩洛哥做考古挖掘时，有了令人惊奇的发现。或是 An astounding array of traditional Russian foods was spread out on the table. 这张桌子上摆满了令人惊奇的传统俄国菜。
So we looked before at the Belize Barrier Reef, but even this amazing example pales in comparison to the most extensive coral reef ecosystem in the world, Australia's Great Barrier Reef. So most people, when they think about barrier reefs, they might think of Australia's Great Barrier Reef. All of the other ocean rainforests pale in comparison to Australia's Great Barrier Reef. So let's look first at this phrase, to pale in comparison to something. It basically means something is not as good or not as special as something else. So in this case, we're comparing the Belize Barrier Reef to Australia's Great Barrier Reef, and the Belize Barrier Reef pales in comparison or is not as amazing, not as extraordinary as Australia's Great Barrier Reef.
Right, so you could be talking about a tall building that's maybe 20 stories tall or something like that, but it pales in comparison to Taipei 101. That is much taller. It's much more impressive. So yes, indeed, the barrier reef next to Belize in Central America there is impressive, but still it is not as impressive as the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. And we're describing the Great Barrier Reef as being the most extensive coral reef ecosystem in the world. If something's extensive, that means it goes a long way. It is large in scope. You could say that someone has extensive knowledge in something. Like my friend Steve has extensive knowledge about photography. Every time I have a question about photography, I talk to him because his knowledge is quite extensive. And this coral reef ecosystem is extensive. It's huge.
Right. So this barrier reef, Australia's Great Barrier Reef, this vast organic structure, which stretches for over 2,300 kilometers down the east coast of Australia, supports an astonishing diversity of species, including 30 species of whales and dolphins, 1,500 types of fish, and 14 species of sea snakes, many of which are rare or endangered. So the Great Barrier Reef is a place that supports a lot of different sea creatures. And these sea creatures don't make up just one species or a few species. They make up a diversity of species. So diversity here refers to a situation when different things exist within a place or a group. So we can think of the word biodiversity or biodiversity, for instance, when we are talking about an area that contains a lot of different forms of plants and animals. So the Great Barrier Reef has a diversity of species, and this diversity is astonishing. So it's very surprising because people normally wouldn't expect such diversity or so many species living in the Great Barrier Reef.
Yep, it's a Great Barrier Reef. It's vast, it's huge, it's extensive, and we're also describing it as being organic, which means it is basically a living thing. It's not dead like rock or something. Organic, of course, refers to something that is alive. And that's why organic vegetables are so popular these days, because they don't use so many fertilizers and pesticides and stuff like that. But again, this is an extensive coral reef that stretches over 2,300 kilometers. So that's much longer than the Belize Barrier Reef. But still, the Belize Barrier Reef is impressive, but this one is even more impressive. And it goes down the east coast of Australia. And again, it has an astonishing and amazing diversity of species. And that diversity includes 30 species of whales and dolphins. So if you're into whales and dolphins, that is the place to go. You could go for whale watching tours, I suppose. And there are also 1,500 types of fish. So if you're into different kinds of fish, you can go there and check them out. And then, of course, we've got 14 species of sea snakes, which I think a lot of people might not enjoy because I think most people are afraid of snakes. They're kind of creepy. My wife happens to be a big fan of snakes. So she's a member of a snake appreciation club online. She's showing me pictures of snakes all the time. But she hasn't yet shown me pictures of sea snakes. So maybe she ought to take up scuba diving and go down into the ocean and find some sea snakes, snakes underwater.
Yes, and many of these sea snakes are rare or endangered, so they might not be around for very long, and there aren't many of them. So it's good that there is a snake appreciation group that might raise consciousness, raise awareness of these sea snakes and their plight.
So as you can tell, there are lots of things to see if you go to the Australian Great Barrier Reef there. And I think that's probably a place that's closer to Taiwan than the Belize Barrier Reef. So indeed, if you're going down to Australia, you should find a way to check this out. I understand quite a few young people from Taiwan go on these work-study holidays down there to work in wine vineyards and things like that. So yes, indeed, if you do have the time and the money, check out the Great Barrier Reef. It will be worth your time.
Yes, and another thing about Australia's Great Barrier Reef, it's the fact that it's so huge that it can be seen from space. And this is something that you can check out online. If you just type into Google or any search engine, Great Barrier Reef from space, you will be able to see pictures of that. And it is indeed quite extraordinary, quite astonishing.
This is pretty amazing here. You can see the Great Barrier Reef from space. And so if you have a chance to get aboard the International Space Station, or if you're rich like some of those rich hotshots who are going into space, then you can go along with them and look down and say, hey, Mom, I can see the Great Barrier Reef. Isn't that fun? Okay, that brings us to the end of our lesson for today. Now it's time to listen to our beloved Chinese teacher.
各位同学大家好，我是 Hanny。 我们来看今天的文法重点。课文第一部分提到，尽管珊瑚礁只占海床不到1%，但所有海洋物种中有超过1/4都仰赖它们为生。文中是用到 Despite making up less than 1% of the ocean floor 来表达尽管只占海床不到1%。我们来看这边有2个重点。第一个是 despite 或者是用 in spite of 是表达尽管虽然怎么样，要特别注意它们是介系词哦，那后面是要接名词或动名词。例如 They continued to hike despite the rain 尽管下雨他们还是继续健行。好，那特别注意，如果要在 despite 或者是 in spite of 后面接子句，不能直接接哦，因为我们刚刚说过它是介系词，所以这时候呢，你要在 despite 或者是 in spite of 后面先接一个名词同位语，可能像是 the fact 之类的，然后再接 that 子句。好，那常见的句型是 despite the fact that 子句，或者是 in spite of the fact 再加 that 子句。像刚刚例句就可以说 They continued to hike despite the fact that it was raining。 好，再来看第二个重点是片语动词 make up 在这边是指组成构成，那主动的用法你就可以用部分 make up 整体，那被动用法呢，你可以用整体be made up of 加上部分。例如 The book is made up of 10 chapters 那本书是由10个章节组成的。我们顺便也来补充其他表达组成的方式。第一个，你可以用动词 compose 来表达。用 compose 表达组成构成的时候，它的用法呢就跟 make up 相同，所以同样会分成主动和被动的句型。你可以用部分 compose 整体，或者是整体 be composed of 加上部分。例如 Experts from different fields compose the team来自不同领域的专家组成了这一支团队。那第二个补充的用法是用 consist of 来表达，它的用法呢是整体加上 consist of 再加部分，这边要特别注意，它不能用被动语态表示。例如 The band consists of 5 talented musicians 那个乐团是由5位很有才华的乐手组成的哦。那第三个补充的用法是用动词 comprise 来表达 comprise 那它的句型会有2种，第一种你是用整体 comprise 加上部分，或者是整体 be comprised of 加上部分，这时候是以整体来当主词的。那如果你用部分当主词的话，它的句型就是部分 comprise 加整体。我们来造个例句 The album comprises 10 tracks 那张专辑是由10首歌组成的。好，那么以上是今天重点整理，我们来回顾今天的单字吧。
Coral. Richard bought his elderly mother a necklace made from red coral. Extraordinary. This bird has extraordinary feathers which it uses to attract a mate. Boast. This art museum boasts an impressive collection of paintings by Thomas Cole. Extensive. If you have time, visit the palace's extensive gardens. Astonishing. That apartment complex was built with astonishing speed. Diversity. We publish articles that represent a diversity of opinions.
Well, everyone, today's article has come to an end, and I sure hope you enjoyed reading along with us. I am Roger.
I'm Helen.
See you next time.